Haidong! So in this video, we're going to talk about why the Haidong Gumdo cut is on a 45-degree angle. I'm going to compare the 45-degree cut, which is canonical with the Federation, with the more 30-degree cut, so 30 degrees going this way, 30-degree cut going through the target here. So once again, full transparency. So in the past, so pretty much up until actually a couple months ago, I always thought that the 30-degree cut, again, the one that's going to be cutting across this way, was better, right? Up until a couple months ago, this is how I cut. When I was fixed to do this several times, I would do it for a couple days and it would slowly come back this way because my brain had rationalizations for this. So what I'm going to do is first discuss this 30-degree cut and then also discuss why it's going to be different for the Federation. So why would someone cut this angle? So this is not the 45, right? So this is closer to the 45. So this is a good about 30-degree angle. So why would we necessarily aim for this one as opposed to another angle? So if you're here, so notice what I'm going to be puncturing. So as I'm cutting down, so the first target is here, right? So if I'm able to actually just even graze this, I'm going to stop the opponent's ability to raise their arm here because I'm severing these muscles. Again, the further I go down, if I cut in here, there's some really good arteries that I can potentially sever or even like chip off into if I'm cutting down here. Obviously, cutting all of this, if I actually am able to embed myself that deep, I'm very clearly going to sever something pretty important. But even if it's grazing, right? Even if it's a grazing cut, it's going to sever these muscle groups, sever the pectoral muscle. If I don't nick the artery here, even if I follow through this way, and it's a very, very light cut, it's going to be severing muscles that your opponent needs to actually engage with his or her sword. In comparison to a 45-degree cut, so notice what I would be cutting. I would be cutting either at the shoulder or underneath the shoulder, right? So yes, if you sever this, it's going to be very, very painful for them. But because it's so low down, yes, again, painful, but I can probably still twist and move without necessarily engaging this part, although it's harder if they sever this for them to, again, move. So if I cut on that 45, it looks like I'm going to hit like every possible major bone, which is actually not what we want to do, right? So if I cut this way, it might hit this bone. Again, all these things, again, it's going to be up against the grain of the rib as well. Like all of this is actually going to be pretty hard to cut, right? So best case scenario, if I have a really good cut with this, I might be able to sever the arm, right? But it's going to probably embed itself in the rib down here. And again, yes, obviously this is going to bleed out, but it's not as effective as potentially cutting on a 30-degree angle. So why, one might ask, okay, so the Federation's cutting here instead of here. So what is going to make this better than this? So let's first talk about that 30-degree angle. So if I'm here, right, so if I'm cutting you straight on and you're able to actually hit this angle, obviously I'm going down, right? So even if it's a fairly light cut, it's still going to do some pretty heavy damage, maybe with the exception if I'm wearing armor and stuff like that. But if you cut me here, I am almost certainly going to go down, especially if you follow through with the cut. So why does this not work, right? So in combat, obviously if you hit me here, good. If I'm here, not so much, right? So the more I move here, so as I'm trying to evade your cut potentially, the less likely you're going to hit anything important, right? So as I move, so right now, almost certainly dead, almost certainly, maybe not, maybe not. You might even get my wrist, but the more I move, the less damage I'm going to receive, which is obviously the point of evasion. So let's actually compare that with the 45-degree cut, right? So if it's 45 degrees, obviously if I hit here, it's not the best cut, right? But the more I move, it's actually going to affect the height a lot less, right? So if someone is trigonometrically inclined, you'll actually be able to find out if you're cutting 30 degrees, I have about this much to go. So I can move this much, and if I'm all the way over here, I'm completely out of range. Versus 45 degrees, I actually get an extra 40%, actually more than 41, I think 41%, more direction this way. So he has to move a lot more in order to completely evade my cut. And this is going to be something that's generally going to be a theme for Gumdo, right? So the idea is I'm up against, first of all, many people. It's supposed to be a battlefield situation. And what happens in the battlefield? Your opponents move, right? So if your target is not willing to move or can't move, by all means, go for a 30-degree cut. But again, if you're in the middle of a battlefield, 45 is probably the way to go. But that's not even the most interesting reason to cut on the 45. So the Sangsu forms might actually be using what's called a Sangsu gum. So the Sangsu gum is a really, really long sword. So if you believe certain texts, it's supposed to be almost like 7 feet long, with like a normal length handle and stuff like that. So in general, the Sangsu forms are intended for a very, very long weapon. Because I do not actually have a Sangsu gum, I'm going to use this bow staff. So let's first see that 30-degree angle. So if we start here, and I try not to hit my ceiling, I'm going to try to cut on the 30-degree angle. I'm going to come back down here. So notice what happened. I hit the ground pretty soon, right? Versus, let's try a 45-degree angle. Here, still might skim, but it's hardly embedded into the ground, right? So if you're using a really, really long sword, which the Sangsu forms might be, again, not canonical, but they might be using a really long sword, which also explains a lot of other aspects of the Sangsu forms, using a 45-degree cut is going to be the way to go. Also note, this is going to be a really long, really heavy weapon, right? So this is all meant to be steel, obviously without handle. It's all meant to be steel, it's all really heavy, and it's wielded by a Sangsu user, right? So Sangsu is one of our first forms. It is in fact our first set of forms. They're not going to be necessarily doing all the fancy, fine-tuning techniques. They're going to be just trying to not die, right? So if we're here and we try to do our 45 cut, here I can engage a lot more. Again, I might still hit the ground a little bit, but again, I can cut pretty happily without embedding my sword into the ground. As opposed to, again, if I'm trying to aim for one person, I'm cutting down this way, again, almost certainly I'm going to hit the ground before I can even fall through with my cut. Now, if I'm using a really long sword, I'm just cutting down that 45, it doesn't matter actually where I hit as much, right? So although I'm going to be hitting on this 45, I'm not going to be necessarily hitting all the major arteries with the first strike. If I hit you with a giant piece of metal, going fairly quickly because it's really, really long and angular velocity and all that fun stuff, that's going to take you down, right? And if I'm falling through that cut, again, notice also the Sangsu have deeper stances. If I fall through that cut, that's just going to drag you down if it doesn't actually break you open. So because Sangsu is also one of the first forms that you learn, so this is intended for people who've never held a sword before, first time really going to combat, even for a while until you learn Yedo. So the idea that a really, fairly inexperienced person just wielding a really, really big sword, the more likely the more likely they don't hit the ground, the more likely they're going to be able to keep going with another cut. And additionally, if you cut on that 45-degree angle, you're more likely to maintain your momentum. So especially if you're using a really, really long, heavy weapon. So for example, in the beginning of Form 2, if I'm here and I cut on the 30 degree, I have to kind of wrap it back up in order to keep the momentum going. As opposed to if I cut on that 45-degree angle, I'm here, I can already keep it going that way. And yet another good reason for this 45-degree cut is going to be our third, right? So if I'm cutting here, it's also going to be easier for me to use my false edge as a block, right? So if I cut up here, I can use my whole body. So again, if I'm in Tato say, for example, if I'm here, I can hit back up pretty easily, as opposed to if I cut down, I'll be engaging more of my arms, as opposed to my core here, arms here. So again, if I cut on the 45, I can bounce back the way I came if I need to. So a drill that I would like you to try, so assuming you have the ceiling for it and you have a bow staff or something you can use for this, try going through, for example, Sangsu 2. So again, notice the yellow background to this thumbnail. That means it's going to be associated with Form 2, right? So from here, just beginning of Form 2, right? So crank it through, right? Again, you can use that false edge, up, coming back down that way. Obviously, if you have the ceiling, even if you do have the ceiling, make sure you don't break it. If you have the space for it and you have the equipment, try going through a form with an ideally heavy bow staff. As with everything else, practice on your own as well, right? So try doing a 30-degree cut, try doing a 45-degree cut, and see the difference, right? So knowing that each of them have their good qualities and bad qualities, keep that in mind as you go through your form. So remember, the 45-degree cut is going to be good for, again, a moving target. It's going to be good for if you're using a longer weapon, so the longer the better in that case. And also, you can use that as a fine rebound for a false edge block. Haidong!